Hey there, everyone. So it's Matt Gomez here from Acro Media. Today we're going to do a Q&A on personalization in e-commerce. So I'm, as I said, Matt, and I'm the Director of Business Development here at Acro. I work with a bunch of different companies in both the B2B and the B2C space around e-commerce and technical architectures. And today we're specifically going to focus on personalization and what that looks like in an e-commerce setup. Some of you may know Acro Media are a digital agency. We specialize in e-commerce. Again, I'm not exclusively B2B and B2C, that's the company as a whole. And we do help companies figure out what their technical architecture look like. So not simply what e-commerce platform to use, but how that ties in with all of their backend systems and additional platforms they should add on. And thus today's talk. So I have with me a lovely gentleman from Demandbase, Travis Breier. I'm going to have Travis explain a little bit about what Demandbase is and what he does over there, but he's a super smart guy in the field of personalization. And with that, I'll hand over to Travis to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. So Demandbase is an account-based marketing company. We've been around for a while, and my role within the company is as a product marketing manager. So I own, among other solutions, personalization. And so we'll talk a little bit about what it is, kind of how you go about it. But Demandbase is more than just personalization. You can advertise in a personalized way. And kind of the whole goal is to smooth the process that folks are taking through that marketing funnel. So really interesting stuff. Could go on a long time about it, but personalization is the topic today, and excited to share kind of my perspective on it.
Perfect. Thanks, Travis. And yeah, so that's awesome. So that's what we're going to cover off today. And I have one question for you first. So Travis is a student athlete, or was a student athlete, I should say, in basketball. How tall are you, Travis?
6'4".
6'4". Okay. The reason I ask is that one of my team members, I hadn't met him in person. We hired him during COVID. It's all been on Zoom. I discovered yesterday mid-call that he's 6'7".
Oh, wow.
And it blew my mind that I didn't know. Okay, so you're a more reasonable sized basketball player, all right?
You think they got to stand up and you realize how tall they are. I've had that happen. I've had that reaction.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So yeah, anyway, so so personalization, I think the best place to start is, what is personalization and broadly, how does it work?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And I think personalization, it can be a little bit misunderstood, right? It's getting the right content to the right viewer at the right time. But I do want to point out, it's not an arbitrary decision of what content should be presented. It should be rooted in logic. And the great thing is there's a lot of really valid data points out there now, whether that be through website analytics, where you can go and see like what industry is engaging with what content and what's working, right? And you can also extend that to intent, which is something that Demandbase specializes in, where you can say, hey, I want to figure out who's showing intent in X, Y, or Z. And then you're going to cater or create an experience that is catered to that interest. And so, it's first matter of figuring out kind of what you want to do. And then actually how you do it is by you change maybe the image, you might change the copy, you might change the CTAs. And that's going to make the experience a little bit smoother for whoever you're actually targeting with that experience. So there's no right or wrong answer necessarily. It's just figuring out what you want to achieve and figuring out the best way to actually get there.
Perfect. And I've heard in personalization kind of the premise or the approach of kind of crawl, walk, and run. So a staged approach. Is that something you guys kind of subscribe to?
Big time. Yeah. It's important to approach personalization not as this overwhelming, hard to scale, hard to create effort. The reality is you can really easily do this with your existing tech stack. And the way that you can approach this is with a crawl, walk, run approach. And we recommend that, right? I mean, it's one of those things where you might start by personalizing the customer experience with the hypothesis that you want to increase the engagement with a specific page. And then maybe that's just the one experience that you create. From there, once you've figured out basically how you can actually go about creating that experience, you might extend that to a few different segments. Maybe it's not just customer, but now it's maybe the prospects they're going after, or it's a specific demographic in the commerce space. So, figuring out what you want to achieve and then kind of expanding from there, because it's very, especially with Demandbase, it's very easy to scale personalization.
Got you. So I assume that's the crawl is the kind of test it out with a few basic pieces within your kind of current site infrastructure. Walken is bringing in another platform to use some of those insights and tools, and then runners, once you validate all of that, you're really going at it.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think it's, there's a few steps involved here, right? It's understanding why you're doing it.
Yeah.
You're defining segments from there. And then once you've defined the segments, you're figuring out what pages to actually customize. And that's very simple. I mean, you can just start with that one page and then expand from there. So crawl, walk, run is a mantra that we've used even beyond personalization at Demandbase. So certainly recommend that with folks kind of just getting into, just getting started with personalization.
Yeah, it's a similar process to kind of, an MVP of a product, right? You test a small piece, validate a premise, and then kind of go from there, right? Yeah. So if someone thinks that personalization might be for them, like, what is their first step?
Yeah, so I think, determining what your customers are trying to achieve in their interactions with your brand is the first step. Once you've done that, you want to use the insights to develop a hypothesis for how personalization can actually help them reach their objectives. It's not about you, it's about them, right? And so once you've figured out kind of how you want them to interact with your brands, you develop that hypothesis, then you want to define success metrics for personalization projects based on a business goal. And I think this piece is really important because you really need to, if you're the one who's driving this internally, it's important that you have buy-in from your broader team members so that once you do get the experience live, you get some traction, you get some metrics, you're not getting a reaction of maybe a lack of enthusiasm. Rather, you've aligned on the metrics already, and there's kind of joint enthusiasm around these metrics that you established before actually getting started with that, right?
Got you. And so you mentioned metrics. What sort of metrics are you typically looking for then to kind of justify getting involved in personalization?
Yeah, well, I think especially we're talking about e-commerce today. So digital commerce started with an exclusive focus on transactions, right? But it is morphed into being all about the experience. And so I kind of view this in two categories. There's the metrics that will always be important, which can be revenue, right? Driving revenue will always be important, no matter what metrics you bring to the table. I think the higher ups will always put an emphasis on that, and rightly so. And so I think that the other metrics are going to be related to specific goals. So just to name a few, the reality is that personalization can actually have an effect on lowering the cost of customer acquisition. Even customer retention programs and customer support is bringing down that cost. Right. And then I would also say that when executed properly, personalization is enabling a more relevant experience. And therefore, it's going to smooth that process of actually converting. So we have another one with conversions. That's something that we track internally. Our conversions increasing. And then the bottom line there is it also increasing revenue within that specific target segment? And so I think that there's a few different metrics you can choose from. Depending on what segment you're going after, you might change that metric of emphasis. Yeah. But revenue is obviously always going to be important.
I like that, and I think just to kind of reiterate that point, I think it's really good to state, like, it's not just about baseline revenue. As you said, cost of acquisition, which is huge for e-commerce, especially when you're looking at a lifetime value, and then conversions for that traffic, and then retaining those customers through that personalization and personal experience, right? They will drive that baseline revenue number. Yeah, it's a real good point. Yeah. So from a personalization point of view, I mean, you guys obviously do tons of this across all sorts of companies. Is there some baseline kind of best practices?
Yeah, so I think as it relates to best practices, again, it's starting with understanding why you're doing it. Like, what's the point of taking this effort and making that investment? Because again, we just talked about, the metrics that you would track. That should be enough to justify the investment if you're choosing the right metrics. Right. So understanding why you're doing it. Once you've defined the segments, customize, in different ways. It might be swapping out the images. It might be updating the CTAs. You can get creative with it. Maybe you're redirecting competition to your careers page. I mean, who knows? Maybe that's the interest there. Jokes aside, though, I think that figuring out kind of what pages are getting a lot of attention, and then what elements of that you can actually change. And it's very easy to do with Demandbase. All you're doing is basically selecting the HTML element IDs. And then from there, it's going to be dynamically changing based off of what experiences that you've set up. so that you can have, you can kind of smooth that process of conversion for the respective audiences.
Got you. Okay, and kind of, I mean, with Demandbase specifically, do you guys just provide the technology, or do you help the clients figure out what those metrics are and which pieces should be changed?
Yeah, so but what we're doing basically is working with your existing CMS.
Yep.
And we're completely supplementary to it. We're not replacing it. You're not having to get rid of anything in your tech stack already. And you're basically using Demandbase, the Demandbase platform, and going in and kind of choosing what elements you actually want to change and then doing that within it. A second part of your question, I'm failing to recall. Do you mind repeating that?
Yeah, no problem. It was so when, I guess, so I'm putting myself in the position of a company here, and like we've identified that we probably should do some personalization. We've identified some metrics that we want to improve. So whether that's, we do want to lower our acquisition cost, or we do want to drive kind of continual purchases, so a larger lifetime value. We've identified that we want to do those things. They're actually going to be probably pretty generic across all the companies. Everyone wants to make more money and continue to make more money. But as someone who's not an expert in personalization, maybe I'm not sure which pieces would be the most appropriate. Is that something that you guys help with as well? Or is that something exclusively that we would do through someone like Acro Media?
Great question. Yeah. So really, you come in with Demandbase, and we're very much consultative. So you basically have a dedicated account team, right? And so you have a CSM among other roles that are basically specific to your account. And so you have somebody who has dealt with personalization with other customers, for months, if not years, available to you to ask questions. So by all means, you have somebody there who can kind of help advise you. But if you don't want that, no worries. Like, you can absolutely kind of take it self-serve and kind of get experiences live on your own. But it's a great question, because I think that is a fear that some customers have. And by all means, you'll have somebody there who can kind of help advise you and kind of guide you through figuring out the ropes.
Yeah, that's perfect, because obviously the technology aspect of it is one piece, right? But if you don't have the experience in your team to know how to leverage that technology, right, the value is lessened. That's cool. So one thing that you mentioned in one of the earlier questions was, and it just stuck out for me to kind of dig in a little bit, was around intent data. So can you just expand a little bit on what intent data is, how intent data is gathered, and the sort of things that people can kind of intuit from it?
Yeah, so intent is core to Demandbase. It's one of our differentiators in the space. And really what's going on there is we're figuring out what signals different accounts are showing off of your website, which you're not going to get by looking at your website analytics. Now, website analytics is great. We do integrate with Google Analytics, Adobe Analytics, and we're appending firmographic attributes there. But when we think about the journey, it's really important to figure out, it's important not to wait until they get to your website to actually start engaging with them. If you do that, especially in today's world, the reality is your competition is likely going to beat you to it. And so it's really important to figure out kind of what folks are searching off your website. And that's really what intent is. It's defining specific keywords. Maybe it's, you're starting out with your SEO keywords, and you're expanding that maybe to include competitive intent, or just, specific to your industry. And then you can see within Demandbase, specific to, specific accounts, what are folks engaging with off of your website? And then you have that advantage so that, by the time they get to your website, more than likely your team has already reached out, or hopefully. So, it's a really key part of the account-based marketing approach, where you're basically engaging them throughout the funnel versus waiting for them to actually raise their hand, because by that time it's just too late.
Got you. Okay, so just to reiterate that then, so part of what Demandbase is doing is looking at companies' activities when they're not doing anything to do with your site, when they're just searching through whatever means they're searching through online, and feeding you that information to say, hey, this person's an active buyer in your space.
Exactly right. And the way we're doing that is we're not making any assumptions necessarily as to what you care about. You're basically going into our platform and defining what we're calling keyword sets, where you can say, hey, this is the competitive keyword set. So if companies are showing competitive intent, I want to know about that. And then I can start reaching out to them with appropriate type of messaging. And it might be specific to your product and onwards.
That's an interesting point to make then. So the personalization in this context isn't simply about when someone comes to your site and you serve them up some location-based pieces or some specific content based on what you know about them. It's actually about being able to build out a system where you're prospecting and reaching them before they've even reached you.
Exactly right. It's a full funnel approach, right? It's not getting caught up on, oh, well, we can only engage with them once they get to our website. Again, we talked about it's less about the transaction now, it's more about the experience overall. And so making sure that they have a positive interpretation and an awareness, more importantly, of your brand before they even get to your website. Because they might convert with competition before they actually get to your website or you've had the chance to talk to them. So really important that you're kind of considering all touch points throughout the funnel.
Perfect. And for those watching the Q&A, I think just to reiterate that point again, personalization is a full funnel thing. It's not simply about serving up personalized information on site, which is a component of it and a key piece, but it's about having all of that intent, all of that understanding so that you can market to them when they're in a buy-in position or a research position, but they don't know about you or haven't even considered you yet. That's huge, right?
Yeah. What I might add on to that, Matt, it's one of those things where, a byproduct of personalization is higher revenue, right? And digital commerce is a really good example of this. We talked about what it can do from a customer acquisition standpoint, lowering that cost. But I think that it's really appealing or can be appealing to the broader org if you approach it from that angle. And I think that it makes sense logically once you get to the point of saying, well, we don't want to wait until they raise their hand. Let's start engaging with them prior to that. Got
you. So talking about Demandbase specifically then for personalization, what does the suite of tools actually look like? So you have a dashboard, I assume, that you can use. And I'm saying I assume, I've used Demandbase, but for people that haven't, you have a dashboard, I assume, where you can get those intent data, you can use the metrics, get information that you can use to leverage. Is there then any outreach tools built within it, or do you export those lists? What does the tool set look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So within personalization, which is a solution you can buy, one of a few within Demandbase, you're basically getting site customization, which is relevant to kind of what we've been talking about so far, which is changing different elements of a page and then presenting that experience to a specific segment. Within that as well, if you purchase personalization, you're also getting forms. And the logic there is, there might be a gated page, right? That might be one of the things that you're personalizing. And, there's some percentage, statistic here where if you shorten, if you get rid of one form, or one field on your form, the percentage likelihood of them converting increases by a non-trivial amount. And so what we're doing is basically identifying via Demandbase's, proprietary database, among other kind of factors, identifying the company that the individual associated with, and then filling in some of those blanks so that you don't have to actually ask them what industry are they in or what company are they with. We're figuring that out kind of from the email they entered. And then we're making them fill out a lot less fields so that we increase the likelihood of them actually converting.
Got you. So then, again, looking at personalization broadly, it can apply across all industries, across all verticals with regards to B2B, B2C. From the sounds of it, though, Demandbase as a solution really is most powerful for B2B. Would that be a correct assumption?
That is correct. Yeah. So we're working exclusively with B2B. So in the Demandbase context, that's the reality. A lot of the principles, though, I do think carry over to the B2C world. We're talking about, historically it's been transaction oriented. Now it's about the experience. That's the case for both B2C and B2B. Yeah. So I think that, there's lessons to be learned from both.
Yeah. And I think now is, just to kind of go on a little rant with what we're seeing at Acro is that, especially, so B2C has always been very, as you say, transaction based, advanced with regards to commerce and the tools available to consumers. B2B has been very traditionally slow with regards to e-commerce. So traditionally what we're seeing with B2B is that there's some sort of online lead form, lead capture. But other than that, it's just account transactions. We still have clients who are, taking fax orders and have a call center of people just taking PO numbers, right?
Right.
With the change in that was happening anyway, But what COVID has done is accelerated the need to digitize that process, right? So we're seeing more and more commerce effectively happen online for B2B, right? Because the complexities around purchase orders and account-based selling and large orders with complex pieces, tiered pricing, all of the pieces that made B2B complicated, those barriers are coming down now, right? And I think with that, it's another step for B2B to understand that these sort of personalization tactics, and especially with tools like Demandbase, make it really sophisticated in not only being able to, serve your customers in a personalized way that should increase bottom line through various metrics, but to help them prospect and find new B2B companies, right? And customers, I should say.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you hit on a really good point there, which is that, again, we're talking about personalization as it relates to customizing the website. There's personalization within the context of ads as well. That's something Demandbase can help out with. There's also the ability to identify new accounts, which is something that Intent can help you with. So I think that there's elements to it. And again, not that you have to rush in all at once. We talked about crawl, walk, run. Really important that you take that approach, not just with personalization, but account-based marketing in general.
Okay, so that leads on to another question then. So you mentioned there that ads is something that can be done through the system, and this this webinar, this Q&A isn't specifically around the Demandbase platform, but the tools that it provides are kind of the industry leader in this space. So it makes sense to kind of keep referring to the tool set. But effectively, so you can serve personalized ads. You can then bring them in with a personalized form or lead capture and or checkout sales flow. So do you have kind of an example of something like that's been done for a customer that was fairly elegant?
Yeah, a few examples certainly do come to mind. I think that, the standard situation that we're seeing is folks come in, they might have some general sense of what target list they want to go after. They have some target list that maybe sales created. And they maybe think that they're reaching out to accounts that are showing the most in-market tendencies today. But then they find out by looking at intent and by evaluating kind of the way that they're engaging with their website today, that maybe there's other accounts that are showing more in-market signals and that might be more worth their time today. And that can change over time, but it's important, for anybody, whatever vendor you're using, to track make sure that you're reaching out to the right folks at the right time, just to not waste your sales time if for no other reason, right? So I think that marketing can win kudos from sales by taking this approach, because it's not about quantity. It's not about getting as many leads as possible. It's about getting the high quality leads that are showing the most high in-market tendencies today.
Yeah. Okay. So I have a question here that came in during this, and it's asking around the technology. So do you need to rebuild your technology? Sorry, that's not the exact word, and I'm paraphrasing. But do you need to rebuild your technology to be able to add personalization?
Not at all. So I think it's a great question, and I think briefly referenced it in that you don't actually have to replace your CMS. You don't have to replace analytics. You don't have to replace any of that. What we're doing is we're coming in on top of that, and we're integrating with your existing tech stack, right? So let's say, for example, you have WordPress as your CMS, and you have Google Analytics as your analytics instance. What we're doing is basically coming in and identifying the elements of the HTML on your page, and then changing that or appending that for the respective segment. We're not actually making any changes to your website. It's just specific to that experience. From an analytics perspective, the way that we're approaching that is, if you're in Google Analytics, you're using custom dimensions. If you're using Adobe, it's going to be EVARs. But the same concept is there, where we're basically going to be adding in firmographic attributes that you can then track to de-anonymize previously anonymous traffic coming to your website. So now it's not, in the B2B context, it's not just, an anonymous kind of metric. Now you can specifically see it's Microsoft, you can see it's Amazon, and you can kind of connect that dots to kind of illuminate who sales should be reaching out to.
Awesome. So so to just recap that answer, not that it needs recapping, that was very articulately put, but effectively you can stick with your existing system, but you can add this as another layer on there. And the big piece that you mentioned there at the end is that previously anonymous users, you now have the intent data on them. So you understand who's coming to your site, which again, if they don't fill out anything or they don't engage in any activity, or purchasing on your site, you can then have your sales teams or your marketing teams or whoever you want reach out to them proactively, right? And do all of that scary internet stuff. That's cool. Let's see. I think I've got another question here. Yeah. It's a good one. Is personalization expensive? So you don't have to talk about dollars, but is it from a relative point of view? Is it a subscription? Is it based on a number of impressions? You can be as loose as you want in that question.
Yeah, well, it doesn't have to be, right? And it depends, right? It's company to company for sure, but it does. It's one of those things in demand-based context. It's not where it's it's going to vary greatly. It's there's the initial cost. Once you own personalization, that's it. We're not upselling you after the fact. Once you own it, you own it. Right. And so if you want to shorten forms and that's it, totally fine. If you want to just do site customization and personalize the website, totally fine. So it doesn't have to be, and again, it's on a case-by-case basis. It depends on perhaps the amount of website visitors that you're getting. And I think that can kind of change kind of the context of the cost. So, that's speaking from a demand-based perspective. I think personalizing in general, though, really does not have to be expensive. Mm-hmm. You can do this all through your CMS, but it's just harder to do. So it's easier through demand-based in that regard, but you can totally do this all through your CMS as well. So depends on kind of the person you want to take.
Got you. And perfect. So I think then, and sorry, what I was going to say, and then I was going to ask another question, but what we're finding more and more, so we use Gartner analysts for a bunch of research and insights into what's happening in industry, right? And there's a couple of kind of key stats and key bits of information that have been coming out recently. And one is that buyers in the B2B space specifically are, about a quarter of them now are millennials. So the old school method of B2B selling doesn't necessarily apply anymore. Buyers don't necessarily want to talk to a salesperson as early as they may be used to. They don't want donuts brought to the office. Not that you can even do that during COVID. But they're looking for a more digital experience. And also there's a lot of data now around the fact that the last kind of digital experience that you had is what your expectation is for your next site, for your next visit, right? And your next experience. So sites that are doing this in a more sophisticated way are winning, because then when you then visit, when these buyers visit your site and they find that, it's pretty antiquated and they don't have the convenience or the insights or the personalized experience that they're expecting, doesn't quite work out for them as well. They don't convert quite as well because it's a disappointing experience, right? So everything we're seeing points to the fact that personalization now is not even a nice to have. It should really form a part of what you're doing. So we don't have any more questions, Travis, but is there any kind of final thoughts you'd like to share before I wrap it up?
Yeah, well, I think just adding on to what you just said, I think the reality is that companies are losing digital sales because of underutilization of personalization, particularly as a means of improving the customer experience. So I think that it's crucial that companies start taking personalization more seriously. And again, it does not have to be this huge effort where you got to bring a bunch of folks in and get buy-in. It's one of those things where you can take that kind of, stage by stage approach. But I think, the reality is that whether you're in B2B or you're B2C, personalization is increasingly important. And if you're not doing it today, you're the folks who are engaging with your brand are missing out on that enhanced experience that you could provide. So, especially with more millennial buyers, it's all about the experience, less about the transaction, which has historically been the case.
100%. Cool. So I think some of the key takeaways, there's been a lot of little kind of nuggets through this. First thing is that personalization isn't simply about, showing someone a localized currency or any of those sort of things on your site. That's obviously basic, but it's about a full funnel approach. So it's not just your inbound, but also your outbound activities that can be A, personalized, and B, planned around the intent data and the information you're getting from a system like Demandbase. And then the second piece is, as you just said, that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing approach. You can take baby steps, you can feel your way around it, and you can kind of grow it as you start to see the results or the fruit of your labor, right? Cool. So Travis, if someone wanted to kind of chat with you about Demandbase, what would be the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, so I would say, feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn. I think it's probably the easiest way, just, coming out of this conversation. And then by all means, reach out to Demandbase. If you go to our website, you might be greeted with a personalized experience. And you'll also be able to see a bunch of contact related information. So feel free to drop my name or just kind of engage with our brand there.
Perfect. So if you do that, remember that they already know who you are. They already know what you're doing, and you can skip straight to the meat of the conversation.
I'll spare that with the chat.
Yeah, right. And from an Acro point of view, if you want to engage with myself, I'm on LinkedIn as well, Matt Gomez. And and Acro are always here for discussions around all sorts of subjects, including personalization. But effectively, if you're considering any sort of transformation in the digital space, especially around e-commerce or digital commerce or account commerce, then we're maybe the guys to just have a no hassle conversation with. So hope you guys found that helpful today. Travis, thanks a lot, buddy. Really appreciate your time and your expertise here. And we hope to see you on the next one.
Thanks so much, Matt.
Bye.
Take care.